Hola, buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos y bienvenides a la mesa del claustro de Sor Juana en la que participamos como sede del 1er Congreso Internacional de Cine y Filosofía, El fin del mundo y los futuros posibles, dentro de los imaginarios cinematográficos. Es un honor para mí abrir este ciclo de mesas y de conferencias. Pues a mi lado aquí está el doctor Rafael García Pavón y pues también tendremos en este momento la conferencia inaugural del doctor Petzinger. Entonces, bueno, pues sin mayor preámbulo, doctor Rafael, adelante.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias, Azucena, y muchas gracias al claustro y a la UNAM, nuestros coorganizadores de este congreso. And thank you very much, Andrew, to be here from New York, Brooklyn, to be exactly in time and space, no, for this inaugural conference. Uh, I will present Andrew Jampol Petzinger in Spanglish, maybe, no? El título, the title of his conference is called Cinema, History, Poetry, Deleuze, Benjamin, Fondane. Andrew Jean-Paul Petzinger es adjunct instructor de filosofía at Fordham University y también es adjunct assistant professor de filosofía at Hofstra University. Su investigación actual es en las áreas sobre todo de la filosofía del siglo XIX y siglo XX europea, la llamada filosofía continental, especialmente existencialismo y postestructuralismo, y de manera más puntual la tradición existencial de la filosofía judía en representantes con figuras como Benjamin Fondane, Lev Shestov y Rachel Bespalov. Actualmente tiene 3 proyectos de investigación: Deleuze y Kierkegaard en contra de la moralidad racional, el existencialismo judío temprano y la Edad Media y el nacimiento de la persecución racional. Entre sus publicaciones voy a mencionar algunas. Está el libro Deleuze, Kierkegaard and the Ethics of Selfhood, que bueno, ya está en la editorial, la traducción que he hecho yo como Deleuze, Kierkegaard y la ética de la individualidad. Benjamin Fondane, an undiscovered reference for Gilles Deleuze. Sartre and Deleuze on otherness. Deleuze, Benjamin and the deterritorialization of film subjectivity. Panentheism, history and the problem of evil. Possibility as an aesthetic and ethical category. Kierkegaard as a thinker of Deleuzean immanent ethics. Well, pues muchas gracias and thank you very much again to be here, Andrew. And now the virtual forum is for you. And after that, maybe we can have a space for questions, virtual and in the site. Thank you very much. You can go.
Sure. First of all, thanks to everyone who's arranged this event. It looks spectacular, and in particular, thank you to Professor Garcia Pavon, who's been so generous to invite me to this. I'm also very gracious, very grateful that I'm allowed to speak in English here. I apologize. I hope that my presentation will be clear to folks. Let me share my screen and we can maybe get started here. If while I'm sharing this, something suddenly goes wrong, someone can please sort of shout at me, and I'll take a pause. Okay. I will assume that's okay. And we can get started here. So, cinema, history, poetry, Deleuze, Benjamin, and Fondane. In this paper, I want to bring together a few figures from the broadly continental tradition of philosophy in order to think about the relationship between cinema, philosophy, and the future. The future here understood not simply as that dimension of human history which has not yet been fulfilled in continuity with our well-formed present, but rather the future in the sense of what one might call, following Derrida, l'avenir, the to come, that which arrives all at adventures and therefore cannot be anticipated. In this connection, I want to focus on three philosophers whose understanding of the nature of cinema, that magical medium perhaps most closely bound up with the imagination, reverie, and the dreams and hopes of the human being, the most come lately medium, and therefore the one which is itself perhaps the most suggestive of the messianic function that has sometimes been ascribed to the work of art. I want to look at these three philosophers whose understanding of cinema brings them directly into contact with a meditation on the very nature of time, historicity, and what we have a right to demand from the future, particularly within the context of a world increasingly condemned by the forces of violence and exploitation. In this context, it will be Gilles Deleuze, we will see, who provides an initial logic of cinema as the very locus of an impossible hope, presenting us with a portrait of cinematic content that brings us into confrontation with the absence of a manageable and livable world. Walter Benjamin, by contrast, will speak to us of the possibilities and responsibilities of cinema within the context of a mass industrial society, responsibilities that can only be substantiated by the resources of a theologically informed understanding of history and our relationship to the threatened past. And finally, the poet and existentialist Benjamin Fondane, perhaps the least well-known of the three, whose generalized critique of rationality will place cinema within its proper non-systematic context as the art form most conspicuously compatible with our human prerogatives, that we should be precisely entitled to think beyond the constraints of rational order, and therefore to return to the very childishness which has forever been the domain of film. In each of these figures, we will see that it is the navigation of a relationship between possibility and the future that animates their reflections on film, what its own possibilities are, to be sure, how it stages the category of possibility as well, but moreover, how it orients us in the direction of a possibility outside of the theater, a possibility that is part and parcel of what it means to be a human being and to demand incorrigibly what we know in every other context to be unreasonable. In this sense, cinema will bear some deeply intrinsic relationship to what it means to be human, and, as such, to what it means to demand the impossible in a world of persistently foreclosed possibility. Part 1, Deleuze, the Mummies of Faith. Perhaps the most famous comment by Deleuze on the theme of the future and its connection to cinema comes in the second volume of Deleuze's cinema books, where he discusses the topic of faith or belief, foi ou croyance, in discussing the nature of cinematic subjects in the absence of a coherent sensory motor schema. In the second book of cinema, subtitled The Time Image, Deleuze discusses the transitions, both aesthetic and socio-political, which served to push cinema from its more classical manifestations in the pre-war period, what he refers to generically as the cinema of the movement image, to the cinema of the broadly post-war era, in which we, quote, no longer know how to react to the situations in which we find ourselves. Contrary to the classical cinema, of which Hollywood would have been the strongest representatives, it is the cinema of the post-war period, and in particular the cinema of post-war Europe, confronted by the horrors of its own societies, German and Italian cinema in particular, but also the very concrete abstractification of a world unmoored from the set of physical and social reference points that had made a conventional set of behaviors and responses possible, that bears an essential relationship to the question of possibility. Deleuze likes to discuss, as prime examples of this cinema, the post-war works of Roberto Rossellini, who, in Germany Year Zero, presents a portrait of the destroyed rubble of Berlin, in which social relations have decayed, and not even a child's optimism is enough to sustain its very life. There is simply no world to which the child can link itself as he jumps from a building to his death. Or, in Europe 51, you can go back to that image, where domestic life has been forcibly disrupted, again, the death of a child iconographizes the rupture of reality, and Irene, played by Ingrid Bergman, is freed into a state of the, quote, meandering form, la forme balade, which first gives her a posture of seeing, voyant, the world in which she was formerly immersed. No action is possible in these worlds. To take another example, in Stromboli, the full title Stromboli, Terra di Dio, the land of God, Corinne is horrified by the brutality of the provincial life she has escaped into. The bonds of sociality, which she had thought might have been enough to integrate her into a world, only repel her with equal force, and she collapses upon a volcanic terrain, unable to leave her adoptive community, nor to remain within it. Characters who are caught in this way, suspended between predictable actions, so that they resemble what Deleuze calls mummies of modern cinema, quote, dismantled, paralyzed, petrified, and frozen, are no longer capable of acting or reacting in the world which has become a quote, purely optical and sonorous situation, une situation purement optique et sonore. Instead of receiving a conceptualizable action in relation to which a character is capable of selecting an appropriate reaction, she is suspended before the ineffective functioning of her former reactions, like a watch whose cogs have been disconnected from one another and yet go on spinning. It is in this context that Deleuze introduces perhaps the most concretely theological and at once political premises of his philosophical thinking. The cinema of such collapses of the sensory motor schema present us not so much with a thought too large for ourselves, what he associates with the sublime cinema of directors like Eisenstein. Instead, the cinema of such collapses witness to its audience what Deleuze calls the reverse side of our thought, the impouvoir of thought to think what it projects just beyond the horizon of the knowable that is there at the heart of all thinking. Quote, the impotence at the heart of thought, and a being of thought which is always to come. It is from here that the concept of belief, croyance, enters. Belief, for Deleuze, refers not to a propositional understanding or expectation from our surrounding world, but rather, and on the contrary, a certain relationship to the world whose alternative is the very feeling of despair which philosophers like Kierkegaard, a persistent reference for Deleuze in these reflections, have so thoroughly theorized. Deleuze only approaches a statement of how to understand the nature of belief in this context. If belief appears there where an action has precisely become impossible or unimaginable, then belief must instead signify a certain orientation towards possibility, in the sense of a possibility of renewed or humane action, a reinsertion into the flow of history under an entirely distinct set of actionable conditions. But the orientation here is not towards a contentful future or imagined world, a sort of Marxist utopia, for example, but rather towards the generative possibility of renewal within the world of disappointment and despair. In Kierkegaard, faith or belief, tro, there is no distinctive term for the two in Danish, is an expectation of an almost inarticulable possibility that accompanies our awareness of rightful resignation and despair. The world has already failed us, and yet we foolishly anticipate our felicity to come from that same mundane direction. This is a sort of belief of which Deleuze speaks. Deleuze frames this belief in the impossible, not as a belief in another or a better world, but rather as a belief in the world, a belief capable of reinserting ourselves into the otherwise abstractified situation in which we find ourselves. In Carl Theodor Dreyer's Ord, the Word, from which this still is taken, it is the faith of a child which permits the impossible resurrection of Inger, after which a stopped clock will be restarted. So there's image of the clock being restarted. The link between the human being and world, quote, is the impossible which can only be restored within a faith, writes Deleuze. It is a necessarily impossible future that has been anticipated, and which belief alone in its receptivity can permit us to bring about. And this, in all simplicity, is what modern cinema, the cinema of time in its pure state, for Deleuze, presents to us. First point, whether by chance or by nature, cinema as the art form which presents us with a dialectic of faith and despair in our modern condition. Yet, in spite of the somewhat romantic sounding presentation of this idea, of Deleuze's somewhat romantic sounding presentation of this idea, there remains an issue, perhaps albeit a superficial sounding one, in Deleuze's account. And the question may be posed as follows. For Deleuze, are we, the viewers, mere consumers of this contentful representation of filmic faith or belief? Are we simply presented with the problem of belief in the world, whose realization occurs primarily, or even uniquely, on the screen and in the form of an imaginary possibility? Or is it really available to us as a practical possibility, even, or perhaps most essentially, by virtue of our relationship to the cinema? Deleuze at times gives the impression that cinema itself does for us something akin to what it represents, challenges us to reckon with the little time in its pure state, that in a condensed form is the very challenge of faith we find represented on the screen as well. But does modern cinema, even in its very best cases, and for all its aesthetic and technological uniqueness, do anything in this direction? Is there any causal, or dare we say metaphysical link, between the problems discovered diegetically in those filmic representations of faith and our own real lives in a world that has become nearly impossible for us to inhabit? For a more palpable sense of cinema as itself a source of such faithful and de-routinized subject formation, we may need to turn towards an earlier theorization of film in its theological, political significance, in the work of Walter Benjamin, who, as we will see, finds in cinema not only a propedeutic for revolutionary subjectivity, but moreover a model for both aesthetic and theoretical practice beyond the domain of cinema in the montage form of historiography, which is itself part and parcel of our political responsibility. Benjamin, the recuperable past. Walter Benjamin's understanding of cinema corresponds to a generalized principle of historical reorganization. In his epochal work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, cinema is marked out by the author as the art form most suitable for the application of concepts, quote, useless for the purposes of fascism, and by contrast, quote, useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art. In this context, cinema stands out even among other technologically advanced forms of media, by contrast with photography, for example, for the ways in which its relationship with the viewing audience establishes standards serving to de-routinize the conditions of public subjectivity, away from conventional self-satisfied forms of bourgeois criticism and towards more immediate, mass-oriented modes of judgment and evaluation. Quote, nowhere more than in the cinema are the reactions of individuals, which together make up the massive reaction of the audience, determined by the imminent concentration of reactions into a mass. No sooner are these reactions manifest than they regulate one another. In other words, in the cinema, we adopt a posture of public evaluation and criticism. We stand as a critically conscious yet collective body of aesthetic judgment. Benjamin goes on to specify the ways in which an individualistic bourgeois mode of critical observation, one which finds its natural concomitant in the series of dreamy associations specific to the art critic's thought process, is disrupted by the more or less direct intrusion of filmic content into the mind of the viewers themselves. In the cinema, writes Georges Duhamel, I can no longer think what I want to think. My thoughts have been replaced by moving images. It's a passage that both Benjamin and Deleuze cite approvingly In this context, it is the non-contemplative subjectivity of the film viewer, the characteristic way in which reflective observation, when it happens, takes place alongside the associative material of a film's montage, that prepares the audience for its own responsibilities as receivers and critics of their contemporary milieu. In this way, they take up, whether intentionally or not, some part of their political responsibility as a public body of evaluation and criticism. And here's a quote. The tasks which face the human apparatus of perception at historical turning points cannot be performed solely by optical means, that is, by way of contemplation. They are mastered gradually, taking their cue from tactile reception through habit, writes Benjamin. By habit, moreover, Benjamin intends the posture that he refers to as one of reception in distraction, Rezeption in der Zerstreuung, characteristic of both cinema and, perhaps surprisingly, those embodied forms of reaction and adaptation proper to architecture, where visual engagement spontaneously takes the form of casual noticing rather than attentive observation. In this way, cinema serves as a, quote, true training ground for a general task of reception and reaction within a complex and non-totalizable society. Cinema is the art form most immediately proper to the style of observation, the behavioral, perceptual, and critical modes of seeing, necessary in a world where speed and complexity have already begun to outstrip the possibilities of normal human viewership. It is moreover this posture of distracted viewership that Benjamin develops in a properly messianic direction in his account of the relationship between our political responsibilities towards the past and the proper form of materialist historiography. In the Passagenwerk, the Arcades Project, Benjamin anticipates the insights of the later work of art essay when he presents a model of a historiography adapted to the, quote, central problems of historical materialism, namely, quote, whether it is possible to conjoin a heightened graphicness, Anschaulichkeit, to the realization of the Marxist method. And he avers, quote, the first stage in this undertaking will be to carry over the principle of montage into history. That is, to assemble large cut constructions out of the smallest and most precisely cut components. Indeed, to discover in the analysis of the individual moment the crystal of the total event, and therefore to break with vulgar historical naturalism, end quote. Elsewhere, he writes of the emerging Arcades Project, quote, method of this project, literary montage, literarische Montage. I needn't say anything, merely show, end quote. To draw upon the analog of what has been said before, I understand Benjamin's comments in these places as seeking to present history in the manner of his own later reflections on cinema, that historiography, as composed from the perspective of materialism, must be presented not in the style of a simple narrativized reflection that might appeal to the contemplative consciousness of the viewer, but rather in such a way, in Benjamin's language, as to produce an image of the past which is synchronic with the present, to grasp it in its very flashing up. It is to this moment of flashing up that Benjamin ascribes a genuinely messianic historico-political function. In his rightly famous On the Concept of History, he writes, I quote somewhat at length, articulating the past historically does not mean recognizing it the way it really was. It means appropriating a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. And he goes on to illuminate the stakes of such a danger in terms of the struggle for an evaluation of the past under the influences of competing political forces. Quote, every age must strive anew to wrest tradition away from the conformism that is working to overpower it. The only historian capable of fanning the spark of hope in the past is the one who is firmly convinced that that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he is victorious. In these passages, Benjamin ties together several elements of what I believe might reasonably be called a cinematic conception of history, not a history which is suited to the contemplative attitudes of dilettantish historians, but rather one through which its readers are charged with a political and theological responsibility for the very rescue of the past under the threat of its fascistic appropriation. Here, in the cinematic conception of history, for which the subject is effectively prepared by means of filmic subjectivity, historiography consists not in getting the past right, nor even in applying our insight into the past for use in the production of a revolutionary future. Rather, what awaits us in the historiographical construction of the past is an immediately revolutionary task of rescue and rectification with respect to a threatened historical moment. Here again, then, is the question of a possibility and a future bound up with a form of knowing and even cognition endemic to film, a future in which the past is understood on the basis of the sort of shock effect conventionally ascribed to filmic montage, in order that it should become an object of actionable comprehension. I want to just kind of show a few images, sort of film references here that maybe arguably have the sort of montage style, the kind of detritus approach that Benjamin refers to with history. He's not necessarily talking directly about film when he talks about making historiography out of detritus, but there are certainly films which seem to do that just as well. This is an example from a film called Because I Was a Painter, a documentary about works of art made in the concentration camps. This is a scene where the filmmakers sort of pull a wall out of somebody who made portraits of number of the prisoners in the concentration camps. This is a shot from a documentary that came out a number of years ago called Shakedown. I think it's called Shakedown. I have the Shakedown there. That's a mistake. It's a documentary directed by a woman named Leila Weinraub that's based almost entirely on sort of her own captured sort of home video style recordings of footage at a club in Los Angeles that lasted for a very short period of time. It was called the Shakedown Club. It was an entirely black lesbian club that had this very short kind of, effervescent period of existence before it was shut down when LA started to crack down on nude performances. And Leila's documentary is essentially just a kind of a composition of all of these often quite grainy, often kind of dark, hard to see, you're inside a club, footage of nights, evenings at the Shakedown Club. This is a shot from a film called Recorder, the Marion Stokes Project. The documentary itself is not, particularly, avant-garde in its form. It's interesting, however, because the subject matter of the documentary is a woman by the name of Marion Stokes. She was a kind of an activist living in Philadelphia, who at some point in her life began taping television. So she started to have a kind of a continuous project of recording essentially everything, primarily news, that came onto television, beginning, I think, in 1979 with the Iran hostage crisis. And she more or less tried to continuously tape. I think the last thing she captured was the Sandy Hook massacre, the date of which I don't even know off the top of my head, into the 21st century. And therefore has, had enormous archive of video footage of just television. So, we have the kind of resources. Marion Stokes never actually used those materials for making a kind of a, kind of a montage object of historical reflection. But the documentary gives good evidence that, of the way in which we have the kind of materials, we have the kind of tools for making those sorts of a documentary works. Okay, second point, therefore, a film is the privileged medium for the forms of knowledge and perception adequate to the demands of politics. I'll actually continue to speak a little bit extemporaneously. There should be a transition here, essentially, to kind of say why exactly I feel like it's necessary to add Benjamin Fondane to this account. I do think maybe we don't need a particular justification. Benjamin Fondane's an interesting philosopher in his own right, but we'll see maybe when we look at his work that some of the sort of maybe some of the ideas that we find in Benjamin a little bit constrained perhaps by the emphasis that he has in the kind of a certain Marxist method is very much kind of generalized in a very beautiful way in Fondane's thought. So in a paper version, an article version of this talk, maybe there would be a kind of a transition explaining or justifying why we have to kind of move to Fondane. So maybe we have no justification for doing that. Here's an image of Fondane himself. In a series of articles spanning the short period between 1929 and 1933, the poet and philosopher Benjamin Fondane, born Benjamin Wexler in Iași, Romania, gave an account of his own ambivalent relationship to the possibilities and limitations of cinema at a time when the art form was undergoing profound aesthetic and technological changes. For Fondane, the unique hope, possibility, and beauty of film lay precisely in what we might consider its faults. It lay, for example, in cinema's tendency towards misunderstanding, such that it was able to, quote, satisfy the tastes of savages, Puritans, and congressional Catholics all at once, among others. It consisted, furthermore, in its vulgarity and low birth, basse naissance, which placed it closer to the adolescent and popular literature of detective novels, romances, and penny dreadfuls. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it consisted in the technological imperfections of the medium, which denied it both the color, depth, and sound that would have been necessary for film to approach anything like mimetic verisimilitude with its subject matter. It was to this latter feature, in particular, the silence of early cinema, that Fondane, somewhat at odds with our contemporary intuitions, attributed its most fundamental aesthetic and humanistic functions, referring to it as a, quote, non-art, as the first non-noble art, and as an a-religious art par excellence. Quote, the final truth, and the one that is indeed a case of la palissade, that's a term for a really redundant observation, is this one. These images are silent, and film is silent, not like one thinks because it is lacking some means to make its characters speak, not as deficient and limited, but rather because its reason for being, the grounds of its good fortune, is to have discovered by chance and by impotence what differentiates it, isolates it from all other arts, and renders it unique, to wit, the fact that it is silent, that it gives us the stuff of the moral, visual, and cosmological world under the aspect of silence. And he goes on, the silent film has given us the world under the aspect of silence. It has excavated the obscure zone of the human being and found there heroic actions, fairy stories, nightmares, horrors. Appearance being denied to it, it was forced to express what lay beneath, the subcutaneous, and the further it went, the deeper it sunk. This is to say that, on Fondane's account, it was precisely because film was silent, in particular because it lacked the literalness and verisimilitude proper to the world of organized discourse, that it was not only able but obligated to generate the tools for a generalized poetization of human experience. Thus, silent film bore a natural tendency of resistance against the overly univocal forms of understanding proper to the everyday world of language. Quote, the exaltations that film gave us came uniquely from the fact that it rescued us from the boredom of everyday life, from the boredom of the theater. We have spoken enough. Everything has become speech. War, born and raised on speech, has in the end pierced its noxiousness, and as if by protestation against words, given birth around us to a sort of cynicism of language, the ultimate final sense of shame of the human being before the great passional events of history, end quote. In other words, it is the orderliness and verbosity of the contemporary world, which for Fondane, silent film was uniquely able to escape. Quote, its good fortune being an absence and a defect. On the one hand, presenting us with the world clothed in the photogeny of lyrical cinema, photogeny being that luminescence of that unique luminescence inattributable either to the object nor simply the technology of filmic capture. On the other hand, it was by giving us the very world which we inhabit under a form of logic and order less univocal in its very essence than that of discourse, one that relied upon, quote, the most simplistic means of conveyance, and the one which lays least claim to intellectual achievement, namely the eyes. I'm going to give a very brief justification for this image, which is taken from Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. I just thought this was a funny image where, you know, Fondane makes criticisms. One of Fondane's criticisms of film is that, you know, that adding language, adding speech to cinema adds a layer of meaning to what already has its layer of meaning, as it were. So this is a funny example that kind of sprung to my mind a little bit, where you have this was a character in a scene who decides to say explicitly what is already the subtext of the film, you know, to verbalize what in any decently made film, could have hopefully been indicated otherwise. It's funny to think about Star Wars as a silent film. That might have been, wonder if that's possible. Anyway, Fondane has this really wonderful quote describing the way in which adding the additional layer of meaning over the visual side of the medium changes it from 2 eyes to 4. So he says it no longer has 2 eyes but 4. Does it see better now? No. Now it just looks like a monster. Okay. So hence, cinema for Fondane is prepared for a general liberation of an entire world otherwise driven back within us, namely the world of a certain naive and infantile set of expectations, our most absurd dreams, he writes, which have been everywhere submitted to, quote, the domain of reason, which has established itself as arbiter, passing itself off as supreme judge, and aggregating to itself all prerogatives. In this respect, for Fondane, film serves an essential human function closely related to what a properly understood philosophy will exercise, if and when it ever resumes its proper intellectual and existential birthright. He writes, an idea that has weighed too long upon our tradition wants the philosopher to be recognized solely by the fact that he is constrained by something, beginning with phenomena. It is thus that philosophy's overzealousness to obey always has caused it to neglect to ask itself whether truth was not what philosophy had made of it, whether the constraining truth is something other than the fruit of our thirst for servitude. In short, whether there is the possibility not of a morality, but of a truth of masters. That is to say, a right to insist upon a truth which edifies, which gives the human being a ground to hope upon, rather than a reason to despair. Thus, Fondane will link the question of whether the subject has a right to demand more of her historical milieu, what we might otherwise understand as our impulse towards unreasonable demands directed against history, to the theme of thought's subjection to the burden of necessity. Quote, like you, he writes, I dream of useful reforms, of great measures to be put into effect, but the atrocious clamor of the world and my own anxiety demand not only a better future, but also a past that has been put right, not just sufferings justified, but also wiped clean, erased, not just healed, but as if they had never been. It is impossible for history or for reason to make what hasn't been not to have been. And yet, whoever needs answers to such questions will continue to demand them, even if they have to be given to him in a form that repels his human reason. Thus, the cinema bears an essential function in relation to our birthright as recalcitrant historical subjects, as Fondane has highlighted, not just to demand a better future, but equally to demand a past that has been put, quote, that has been put right, and the echoes with Benjamin ought to be evident here. Quote, "Let's go to the cinema then," writes Fondane, "because it is the only art which has never been classical, that is, the only art that has refused to accept, in exchange for a promise of flattering persistence, its submission to the dressage of reason, its orthopedic apparel, and its plaster corsets," end quote. Cinema serves for Fondane as a general resource for the promotion of our recalcitrant impulses before a constraining and defeatist view of human history. That there should be a struggle, writes Fondane, is what matters to me. And in this respect, a good film, quote, "attains its absolute perfection and its aim, starting from the very moment that it makes an effort," end quote. In cinema, it is our recalcitrance before not just the future, but equally the past, which is most marked out for us. And regardless of whether the struggle has any expectation of practical or political success. There's a few cases here that maybe we don't have to spend any time dwelling on, but I like Fondane's criticism. You know, it's an interesting line of criticism that we don't typically think about. I mean, the criticisms of sound being added to film and the first dialogue being added to film. And so, you know, one of the things that Fondane really likes is figuring out, you know, who uses sound well, essentially. He really liked, for example, René Clair's first sound film, Sous les toits de Paris, Under the Roofs of Paris, where Clair is kind of regularly sort of, you know, he kind of crowds the audio, the sound of the film with inaudible features. So things happen while trains are passing. There's a scene where characters go behind a door, a glass door, so you can see what they're doing, but you can't hear them. And this is a scene where a bunch of characters kind of, in a humorously, find themselves engaged in a fight, but you can't hear anything that's being said because they're all arguing on top of each other. So you immediately nullify the value of the sound in the first place. There's a number of films that I sort of came to mind as doing interesting things in that direction. You know, we don't have to share Fondane's suspicion of talking film or something. That's probably you know, a little bit redundant to feel. But you know, an example might be A Zone of Interest, which came out just a few years ago. Was really excellent use of you know, kind of figuring out how to think about the relationship between sound and image, where everything happened sort of off screen. You could hear, those of you who have not seen the film, it follows a family living directly next door to Auschwitz and serving to kind of facilitate the process of extermination going on there. And everything therefore happens just off camera. So you have shots like the one here of a flower where you hear what's happening in the camps, but you don't see it. So very nice use of film, of sound in that case. This is a shot from Miroslav Slavish-Pitsky's The Tribe, which was a film that takes place in a school for the deaf, and is done entirely in sign language. There's no subtitles in the film; it's just done entirely in sign language, and therefore you know, have to kind of find a way, if you don't speak sign language, to follow what's going on. And this is a really nice, lovely scene where there's a, you know, violent confrontation that happens, a kind of a hazing ritual. And it's obviously, aside from the ambient noise of rustling around, it's entirely silent. I mean, there's no speech going on during it. So, actually, let me hold there for 1 second. Okay. So to conclude, from what has been said above, it should be clear that the ways in which it should be clear the ways in which a cinema of possibility is linked to a concept of the past as much as to a concept of the future, so far as the latter is understood precisely in terms of its relationship to the past. For both Benjamin and Fondane, to elaborate upon an idea already there within Deleuze's work on the link between film and the opening of possibility in a world viewed as impossible, it is not just our own recalcitrance before the demands of history, which is sketched out to us in cinema. It is, moreover, in a certain recuperative relationship to that history, a setting right of what has otherwise been intolerable in our lives and histories, and an incorrigible expectation of a future which we have no rational right to demand. Here's a few random examples. I'll just kind of be hasty on this. A few random examples of interesting cases where we have film doing things that are what we might think of as sort of broadly revisionist, historically revisionist in nature. Great Silence is an example of one of the so-called revisionist Westerns, that kind of tries to undermine the conventional whatever narrative of Western expansion in the United States. Cheryl Dunye's, I misspelled her last name there. Cheryl Dunye's Watermelon Woman is a terrific film where she sort of imagines herself, the director who's also plays the protagonist sort of imagines herself kind of pursuing this character of early American cinema who has no name, who plays a kind of a mammy character, sort of a Butterfly McQueen type actress, but whom she doesn't know anything about. And Dunye sort of concludes the film by saying, that we have to essentially create our own history. So the character that you see so many grainy photographs of, grainy shots of throughout the film turns out not to have been a real character at all. It's just a character who's sort of imagined as an object of research and investigation, because that itself is a kind of a lost history. And then as a kind of a funny, kind of a contemporary example, there's very, to be extremely blunt about it, is Quentin Tarantino reimagining all these historical moments and kind of imagining them better in some case. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a very kind of clumsy but very nicely square example of that idea. Okay. So in this way, we can participate in the project that film offers us, to participate in the incorrigible and indomitable reveries of human freedom, what Benjamin Fondane refers to as the immeasurable promise of cinema, and to which Deleuze adds hopefully and helpfully, quote, when it stops being bad. The end. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for this three but an integral vision, in a way, of cinema, and three ways of trying to make sense of this world, in a way, more fragmented maybe than before. Then we have some. Then thank you very much again, and we have some time for questions. Maybe we have some people in the virtual chat. Maybe someone wanted to ask. But meanwhile, I wanted to make you a global question in a way. What interests me, what you say in a way, in the three authors, in different ways, they see that cinema is going to, is going to maybe not make another world, maybe not take us to another world, but is going to make us to reintegrate in the actual world.
Yeah.
And this is interesting that, for example, for Deleuze, as you say, the beliefs. Oh, I can see you now here in my. Is a belief in this world,
Yes.
And also this idea of history, very interesting. And as you say in Benjamin, I take this idea of how the montage and the idea of this habit of perception that has to deconstruct like the fascist way of making us to perceive the world,
Mm-hmm.
And finally, Fondane, maybe also one of them, for me, more interesting things is like well, many has been written about the idea, this controversy, no, between the if the pure cinema is only image, movement, no dialogue. But it's interesting that he put here the idea of silence, and I wanted to ask you maybe to try, but more in Fondane, if this silence is more like almost like I remember a little bit Tarkovsky when you talk about silence in Fondane, this idea of filming the tension of how things begin to relate by themselves, no? Then to say it in general, no? These three forms, the belief in this world, the montage to go again in this history fragmented, and this silence that in some way could make everything possible again, no?
Yes.
Do you think these three ways can, I don't know, can be integrated in film theory, or sometimes they can get a confrontation between them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a very difficult question. I mean, whether those three different ideas can be integrated. I mean, I would say that I think what all three of those ideas share in common, I mean, and this is a little bit trivial to say, is that they all seem to be pointing towards some attitude of suspension, some particular kind of receptive attitude that is, I mean, this is it's sort of a question in a way, whether it is something that we simply notice in film, our experience of film, if it is something that film uniquely does and other forms of art do not do, if it's something that film just does particularly well, is to sort of put us in this posture of film, a certain kind of receptivity, and I think that's certainly one of the things that Deleuze thinks we see presented to us as we get to kind of sympathize with characters for whatever reason. This is why I'm sort of curious about Deleuze and whether or not part of what he's trying to present us with is something on the screen or something that happens to us and the audience, and maybe there's not so much of a boundary between the two. Maybe some of it is that we get to sympathize with characters that for whom it's easier to represent experiences of not knowing and experiences of desubjectification, losing their boundary, losing your bearings in a certain sense. And Benjamin certainly, I think, thinks of that as being sort of tied into the technical features of film, the way in which we have to watch it, the experience of watching it. And I mean, one thing that I like in Fondane that I think is kind of nice, is a little bit deflationary, is, Fondane's account of cinema is, he certainly has a lot of the aspirations and hopes that folks of his period attributed to cinema, and, wanting to say, the revolutionary, but Benjamin's like this in some ways, the revolutionary possibilities of cinema, but, he's very quickly sort of, and now it's gone, sort of very quickly it's gone. And then he's also sort of very ambiguous. I mean, if you read some of the things he writes about it, he goes back and forth. Maybe other things are on his mind too in the 30s, but he goes back and forth about, should we have hope for cinema? What should we have? Was cinema just a nice moment? That we had this kind of style of filmmaking. But I mean, part of that is all just to say that, one of the really nice things, and I think, again, one of the things that I think Fondane sort of gets right in cinema is a real ambivalence that it's easy to have to film, where it's very easy to love film, love cinema, and to feel like there's so much that it can do, and to then feel despair about cinema, and feel like you're waiting and waiting, and that everything pushing against it is so powerful to make bad cinema, and then one finds something that sort of returns us to our certain sense of hope. And so maybe some of that's just a way of saying that cinema itself maybe kind of puts us in a posture that we can have with respect to the world itself, which is despair, sudden moment of hope, and that we, if we keep going to the cinema, continue to kind of adopt that sort of posture in some. In that case, there is a kind of a training that we get by continuing to go back and be persuaded or be surprised by film.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Andrew. We are almost at the time, but maybe for ending, all this, you are talking now about hope, and I remember that many of the people that are related with film and philosophy in a way, they have always said, as Deleuze, that maybe film is an antidote to nihilism, no? Mm-hmm. Or, for example, André Bazin, that says that in other times, but maybe these times also, that film can take us can return our innocence to our sight, no? Mm-hmm. And well, but of course, I remember this phrase of Deleuze that says that the enemy of cinema is cinema itself if it doesn't forget the force of time, no? Then I suppose that this whole possibility has to do with how we experience time. What do you think about this idea, finally, of time in poetry, history, and cinema to finish the conference?
Oh boy, that's also a big and wonderful question. I'm tempted to say I don't know what I can say very generally about time. I mean, one thing I will say that I think is nice in Fondane and bringing it into connection with Deleuze is, Deleuze draws this kind of somewhat neat distinction at points. I mean, maybe it's intentionally neat, between, the cinema of movement, the kind of early, phase of cinema. Things are supposed to be a little more tidy narratively and so on. And the cinema of time, the time image cinema, which is supposed to much more directly kind of give us a kind of confrontation with time, and to expose us to time not just as something that orders us, but something that sort of disorders us. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I like in reading both Benjamin and Fondane, and I think it's good due diligence to make sure that we distinguish them. But one thing that I like in both Walter Benjamin and Fondane is they seem like they're already on track, before the era of what Deleuze talks about as the time image stuff. They're already, so tuned in to the idea that what cinema does is gives us some kind of novel way of thinking about time, mm-hmm. and obligates us to think about time differently and in a non-linear way. And so, some of that might be just a way of saying that, that aspect of relationship between cinema and time may have been there since the beginning. So maybe it is there.
Okay. Well, Andrew, thank you very much again for your excellent conference. Then it is going to be there in the links of the YouTube, no? That in a way can be your virtual self can continue to speak in a way. No, and thank you again for being here and giving your time. And we hope to see each other again with the translation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Y gracias a todos quienes hayan escuchado. Nos vemos en las siguientes mesas. Gracias.